Summer in Ukraine is finally here, making it an excellent time to get a nice tan, set up a picnic, and continue to embarrass what was once thought to be one of the mightiest armies in the world. The beginning of June would spell great news for Ukraine, as Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, would announce that the nation would eventually be allowed to join once the war with Russia had concluded. We should probably point out that a big part of Russia invading in the first place is that they really didn't want Ukraine to join NATO, and they certainly didn't want NATO to expand their influence in Eastern Europe. In one of the most galaxy-brain plays of all time, not only did Vladimir Putin fast-track Ukraine's application, but it unintentionally strengthened the NATO alliance and boosted military spending across Europe. The reason Ukraine will have to wait to join NATO is because member countries all agree to come to each other's aid should any of them come under attack. As you might imagine, the alliance is understandably cautious about dragging in as many as 8 million military personnel into the conflict pretty much overnight. While this announcement does not present an immediate solution to stop the fighting, NATO intends to continue its support in Ukraine in the months of the war to come, stating that they will need to prepare for what happens after the war to ensure that history doesn't repeat itself. The most notable event of this month came on June 6th, when the Novokakova Dam in the Russian-occupied area of southern Kherson collapsed, causing major flooding to the region and all locations west of the dam. The dam's destruction is being considered by the United Nations as, quote, the most significant damage to civilian infrastructure since the start of the war. Reports indicate that over 3,500 people have been evacuated from the flooded areas, with at least 46 people confirmed dead and well over 100 injured. The rising water has caused the destruction of residential areas and farmlands within the affected regions, while also severing electrical power and tainting water supplies. At time of writing, the facts of the dam's destruction are still being evaluated by experts in the field. Russia claims that Ukraine intentionally sabotaged the dam to deprive the Crimean Peninsula of water, while Ukraine claims that the dam was deliberately blown up from the inside by Russian soldiers. At 2:35 a.m. and 2:54 a.m. on June 6th, seismic detectors in Ukraine and Romania detected the telltale signs of large explosions, leading many to believe that this is the main cause for the collapse. Experts also say that the dam is non-recoverable, meaning that it's been damaged to a point where it cannot be fixed. Although we're not yet able to determine who blew up the dam, the act was clearly intentional, and the end result was more than catastrophic. Evacuating citizens in the affected regions are still being bombarded with constant shelling, with at least 9 people wounded in Kherson City while attempting to escape the flooding. While the United Nations and other volunteer organizations aid Ukraine-controlled regions experiencing flooding, Russia has denied the United Nations from operating in its controlled regions, citing, quote, security, and a lot of issues and many other nuances, for why they cannot help people in the area. Russia claims that they will be administering aid within their controlled regions to those who are affected. Russia is probably lying. This month also saw government authorities from both Russia and Ukraine state that Ukraine's long-anticipated counteroffensive has begun. Ukrainian officials claim that within the area of Bakhmut, 20 square kilometers have been regained from Russia, while within the western Donetsk region, some smaller villages have been reclaimed. While heavy fighting still rages on in areas west of the Donetsk itself, Ukrainian officials also state that they have made significant headway in the Zaporizhia region, but are being halted by Russian defensive forces. At time of writing, fighting is still ongoing, and information surrounding territorial gains and losses are subject to change. Commenting on the counteroffensive, the Institute for the Study of War stated, quote, Ukraine has not yet committed the vast majority of its counteroffensive forces, and Russian defenses are not uniformly strong along all sectors of the front line. Even though information is constantly changing as the fighting rages on, it is safe to say that all regions of Ukraine are experiencing an uptick in combat this month. It is also difficult to report the situation accurately as we would have liked, as the Ukrainian military have called for strategic silence during the counteroffensive. We're also unable to rely on Russian reports, as they've tended to be as dependable as that one kid on Xbox Live, who claimed, without citing credible sources, they had sexual relations with your mother the night before. This month's best clip of the war is easily this footage of what appears to be a Ukrainian vehicle disguised as a house. The vehicle itself was first featured on a Ukrainian news channel in September 2020, and was later used as a prop in the music video of the Ukrainian rap group Kalush. Some observers have pointed out that the use of such a vehicle may constitute a war crime, as nations are required to distinguish between military objects and things of a civilian nature. The whole point is to not give justifiable cause for one side to attack civilian targets. However, as we keep pointing out, Russia tends to do this a lot anyway. Ultimately, no source we could find could verify whether the housecar was carrying weapons, troops, or had any kind of internal fortifications, but even the prospect makes the conflict even more complicated. As always, we intend to continue our coverage of the war as the counteroffensive ramps up over the coming months. We now move on to more lighthearted news this month with our reoccurring coverage of the war in Ukraine. A conflict so grim and depressing that Cullen the writer considers day drinking more every month he has to write about it. We begin our coverage with an explosion on the 2nd of this month at a St. Petersburg cafe, resulting in the death of Vladimir Tatarsky, an outspoken pro-Russian military blogger, and the additional injury of dozens of patrons. Tatarsky was the main speaker at an event to both literally and figuratively ignite discussions about the war in Ukraine at a cafe, which, coincidentally enough, was formerly owned by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner military group. Tatarsky's biggest claim to fame was when a video taken of him at a Kremlin annexation party ironically blew up, where he vowed that Russia would defeat, kill, and rob everyone as necessary, just as we like it, referring to the people of Ukraine. Tatarsky, during his appearance at the cafe, was handed a gift in the form of a bust shaped to look like him. Witnesses say the patron who gifted the item to Tatarsky made jokes that the item was a bomb right before the explosion occurred. The days following the explosion led investigators to arresting Daria Trepova for the illegal carrying of explosive devices committed by an organized group, and a terrorist act committed by an organized group that resulted in the deliberate infliction of death on a person. Things in Russia would only get worse when later in the month, the Russian government approved a bill allowing electronic delivery of conscription paperwork, making it much more difficult for citizens to dodge the draft without facing intense legal penalties. Talks of a second mobilization wave from Russia have been ongoing for months, but that may soon become a reality under this new law. Focusing now on the war front, this month, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization released a report about the damage done in Ukraine. In this report, the UNESCO estimates that the war has caused roughly $2.6 billion in damage to heritage and cultural sites around the country, and that Ukraine will roughly need $7 billion over the next decade to rebuild its cultural sector. Additionally, the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund released a report estimating that nearly 1,000 children have been killed or injured in the war, while another UN estimate states that a total of at least 1,417 civilians have been killed during the war. As all of this comes for the month of April, Russia will be leading the United Nations Security Council, an organization intended to maintain global peace and security in what has to be the United Nations' most ambitious April Fool's joke. Vladimir Putin is the world's first head of state from the UNSC that has an active arrest warrant out for them, a warrant filed last month due to the war crimes committed in Ukraine. The charges filed against Putin by the International Criminal Court would be followed this month by over 77,000 charges that Ukraine's Prosecutor General, Andriy Kostin, registered against Russia's occupational forces. These accused war crimes include, but are not limited to, murder, humiliation, rape, destruction of private property, looting, forced deportation, forced detention, torture, and many more things you couldn't even do in a game of Grand Theft Auto. The charges come after the emergence of photographic and video evidence of people being executed in the recently liberated town of Bucha, in addition to beheading videos that have also surfaced. At this point, you could probably throw a dart blind at a map of Ukraine and hit a spot where Russia has been accused of war crimes. As the months go on, every time Cullen the writer researches more information for the war in Ukraine, he feels as though all the headlines blend together and are identical to the previous months. It makes it difficult for any of our coverage to ever feel like news, when every story feels like an echo of the previous month's carnage. While Russia claims it is interested in ending the Ukraine conflict as soon as possible, the only outcome where that happens is if Russia achieves total annexation and occupation of Ukraine. So until Russia surrenders to the combined efforts of Ukraine and their foreign support, or Russia achieves their questionable goals, tune in next month to hear more of the same. Perhaps a factor often overlooked when looking at the Russian invasion of Ukraine is its impact on the economies of the nations involved. And as you might expect, economists from both sides are drinking a little more vodka to cope. Within Russia, €300 billion in assets have been frozen by sanctions. The country has officially entered a recession, and the war itself is reportedly costing a staggering $500 million to $1 billion a day. Despite harsh sanctions from the EU and other allied countries, Russian oil exports managed to generate more money in 2022 than from the previous year. However, this was partly due to the nation riding high oil prices that have since decreased. Russian oil revenue has fell nearly 6% in March from the previous year, and as much as 64% in April, quite significant for a product widely considered the lifeblood of Russia's economy. With this in mind, sanctions against Russia have not been as effective as some may have hoped, along with non-NATO nations who are happily picking up the economic slack left in the wake of these sanctions. It also appears as if workarounds have been developed for importing goods into Russia. According to a Norwegian-based risk consultancy firm, €8.5 billion worth of goods have circumvented sanctions, which might explain why Russia's economy supposedly only shrank 2.1% last year, much less than expected. The way this was figured out didn't exactly take a genius, as although EU firms would see a dramatic drop in exports to Russia, neighboring countries like Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Armenia would see an unusual spike in the demand of these same items. Countries who had previously imported virtually no chemicals used to produce body armor were suddenly buying 200 tons per month. And this is when the Sherlocks of the world started to get suspicious. While the EU looks to patch these unintended exploits, Russia itself has struggled with its own unique economic challenge. The biggest of which is that people who become too educated don't want to live in Russia. The nation is currently experiencing a serious brain drain among its population, with a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences stating that no other country has lost so many workers in the scientific field over the past 5 years. 50,000 scientists have left Russia since 2018, and last year alone, the nation is said to have lost a whole 10% of its tech workforce, as much as 100,000 people. Since the start of the invasion, as many as 1 million Russian citizens have fled the country. And these have tended to be the types of people the nation really doesn't want to lose. According to a survey taken in March and April, 81% of migrants from Russia had a university degree, a staggering figure considering just 27% of the Russian population at large has such qualifications. Younger people within Russia tend to be much more likely to be conscripted into the war effort, less likely to show approval of the Russian government, and tend to be more educated than the older members of society, which creates something of a difficult situation domestically. These workers can either stay within Russia, facing the threat of being drafted into a deadly war they probably don't support, or attempt to immigrate to another country, where they'll more than likely be earning significantly more than should they remain home. Many Western nations see this as an absolute win from their perspective, as not only is immigration needed to compensate for declining birth rates, but having a steady supply of young professionals who come educated out of the box does absolute wonders for the overall economy. Although the base cost of war and a bombard of economic sanctions are likely going to make it much harder for Russia to sustain itself in the short term, the exodus of the educated workers and the war now claiming the lives of as many as 200,000 Russians is going to be far more damaging in the long term. The economies of both Russia and Ukraine have suffered untold damage from this war, and its citizens will likely be feeling its effects for decades to come. The world keeps turning, and another month has passed in Ukraine with the war against Russia continuing to rage on. Our first stop on the war front is in the heavily contested city of Bakhmut, where the city continued to experience some of the most intense fighting of the conflict. Wagner Company leader Yevgeny Prigozhin announced to the public that his troops in Bakhmut were dying in mass because they were not receiving a steady stream of munitions.
Gerasimov!
His frustration would lead him to directly calling for Russian military forces to step in, and he would later threaten to withdraw his forces from the city if these demands were not met. A few days later, the Wagner Company claimed to have seized control of the entire city of Bakhmut. However, this was disputed by the Ukrainian army, who only acknowledged that Russian forces gained partial control over the city and that they are at an extreme disadvantage, preventing them from advancing further into the Donetsk region. Pictured on screen right now is the most up-to-date terrain map showing where combat lines currently are, alongside some before and after images of the city of Bakhmut that were released during the middle of this month to give further clarity on how hard the fighting has been. The slightly more alarming piece of news from Eastern Europe happened in the early morning of May 4th, when the roof of the Kremlin was attacked by 2 aerial drones. The incident is being considered by the Russian government as an assassination attempt against Russian President Vladimir Putin.
The drones were destroyed on the spot, causing minor damage to the roof of the building with no casualties or harm being done to anyone. Vladimir Putin was not in the building at the time of the attack, and Ukrainian military forces have openly stated they were not responsible. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the public over the drone attack further, iterating that Ukraine lacks the resources and strongly opposes the idea of attacking Moscow because they are simply defending their homes. US officials and allies believe this attack might be a false flag operation designed to rally the public and give reason for Russia to escalate their military mobilization. Meanwhile, allied countries around the world continue to provide support towards Ukraine in the ongoing war efforts. The United States announced a new $300 million security assistance package for Ukraine, only to be followed up by another $1.2 billion aid package to boost with the upcoming counteroffensive efforts. Other countries have also opened their checkbooks as well, with Japan pledging $1 billion to help nearby nations accept Ukrainian refugees. Belgium intending to use €100 million in tax money on frozen Russian assets to aid Ukraine. And Germany declaring $3 billion will be provided in military aid, which includes tanks, anti-aircraft systems, ammunition, and 31 Abrams tanks arriving in the country for Ukrainian training. In a surprising reversal, US President Joe Biden authorized NATO allies to train Ukrainian forces on how to pilot F-16 aircraft, and eventually provide those aircrafts themselves to Ukraine. The change in policy comes after months of internal debate over escalating tensions with Russia and President Zelensky continuing to put the planes and training at the top of his wish list. With the announcement, several NATO nations have offered to begin training Ukrainian pilots, including Great Britain.
I count, bitch.
With talks of a Ukrainian counteroffensive mounting, tensions have never been higher for both sides of the conflict. Russian military forces suggest that Ukraine's counteroffensive strategies have already gone into effect, while Ukraine did not acknowledge the statement. President Zelensky hopes that the coming months of the war will result in major victories for Ukraine in order to end the war before 2024 concludes. With winter and spring officially behind, the war will likely accelerate in pace for the next couple of months, so we'll continue to provide more updates as the world keeps on spinning.
Only hours after finishing our script for Ukraine this month, the world witnessed what appeared to be a fucking coup attempt. So the following is what we managed to speedrun in the final few days of the month. It's a poorly kept secret that Wagner Group, Russia's infamous mercenary organization, has long been at odds with the traditional Russian army, with occasional friendly fire incidents being reported between the two sides. This month, however, Wagner's leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, would escalate the rivalry dramatically, stating publicly that the war had nothing to do with the official justification of ridding Ukraine of Nazis, or even to curb the threat of NATO. Instead, Prigozhin stated that the entire operation was about the Russian Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, and his desire to earn himself another medal. The feud would continue on the 10th of June, when Shoigu would announce that the Wagner soldiers would now be required to sign contracts with his ministry, effectively spelling an end to the mercenary organization. Just over 2 weeks later, Prigozhin would claim that Russia's defense ministry had carried out an attack on a Wagner camp, showing footage of a burning campsite somewhere in the occupied Donbass. Experts could not verify the validity of the footage, with many speculating that it could have been staged. According to the New York Times, US intelligence agencies have observed signs of a serious plot for some time. On the 23rd of June, a column of Wagner soldiers left Ukraine into Russia and would eventually enter the city of Rostov-on-Don, taking control of the military HQ, from which the war was being run. The building was supposedly taken without resistance, and residents appeared unbothered by their presence, with some posing for photos in front of the tanks. On the following day, Putin would make a national address, accusing Wagner of treason, while Moscow itself was fortified, with armored vehicles and barricades. Supposedly, Putin himself fled to his private residence near Lake Valdai, but we couldn't verify this claim. The Wagner convoy would continue its journey north into Voronezh, where they would shoot down both a Ka-52 attack helicopter and an Il-18 aircraft. At least 18 Russian servicemen died in the aftermath. At around 8 p.m. that night, President of Belarus and Harry Potter's uncle, Alexander Lukashenko, would announce that the rebellion had been called off, as an agreement had been struck. The deal didn't come a moment too soon, as the convoy was a mere 2 hours from entering Moscow. According to a Kremlin spokesperson, Wagner personnel involved in the incident would be granted amnesty and be given the choice to join the regular Russian army. Prigozhin himself would go into exile in Belarus, a fate that seemed astoundingly lenient from Putin, who has become infamous for making his enemies fall out of windows. Prigozhin, a former hot dog seller, has been affiliated with Vladimir Putin for the last 2 decades and reaffirms his intention was never to overthrow the government of Russia. The leader of Wagner did not, however, miss an opportunity to shit-talk the Russian army, stating that his push into Moscow was a masterclass in how the country should have started its initial invasion into Ukraine. He would go on to say, quote, "If mercenaries from Wagner had been carrying out the tasks, perhaps this special operation would have lasted a day." As far as we can tell, this bizarre situation wasn't a foreign-backed plot to aid Wagner, or even a coup to overthrow Putin. In a situation where Russia's best soldiers tend to join its state-aligned mercenary organization, this appears to be closer to the group going on strike, as opposed to attempting to install a new government. Wagner have consistently been at odds with the traditional Russian military, criticizing it for being corrupt, incompetent, and sabotaging their ability to fight. With this in mind, it's likely that Wagner forces are far too valuable to be punished for this short-lived rebellion, which is why they were so quickly pardoned. Although the capabilities of the Russian military do not seem to be substantially impacted by Yevgeny Prigozhin's exciting road trip towards Moscow, it does seem to have struck a significant blow at Vladimir Putin's reputation. Within Russia, there is an understanding that under Putin's rule, citizens are expected to trade personal rights for the stability that Putin provides. However, when a former hot dog salesman can seemingly drive up to the gates of Moscow with a private army without so much as being slowed down, it could be seen as Putin struggling to keep his grip on power. Viewers should be aware that this is still a developing situation, and that new or conflicting details may have surfaced from the time of writing. As always, we'll continue to monitor the war in Ukraine until it finally reaches its conclusion.
What if it's me looking down on me? The world above must also be